Welcome back to the Raw Selection Private Equity Podcast. Joining us today is Sam Bendix, partner of investor relations at Chicago Pacific Founders. He's going to be discussing his framework for capital raising conversations and how you can use this framework for deal origination, interviewing, and any other private equity applications. It's got a terrible name, a bit like Raw Selection, but it's an absolutely phenomenal framework. I've taken a ton of notes of this and looking at how we can implement this into our processes, both from a firm perspective, but also candidate interviewing, prospecting, etc., etc. So let's dive in, and thank you very much for coming back for a second time, Sam. Motivational interviewing. If you can share what on earth that is, please.
Sure. I think it probably is helpful to back up and maybe tell you a little story about motivational interviewing. It happens to start at the first date with my wife a very long time ago. We were sitting at a booth in a wine bar in Chicago, and I was learning about what she did. My wife is a clinical dietitian. She worked with at-risk populations, people with HIV and AIDS. And, I thought that was really interesting. And for me, I was really curious about, how do you get somebody to change their diet when they've been drinking soda forever or eating unhealthy food? And she walked me through this structure called motivational interviewing, where it's designed to really help draw out somebody's own motivations for taking actions. She talked about the fact that she can't just dive into a conversation and say, "You're seeing me, you must feel like you're unhealthy and you want to lose weight." That's a very ineffective way of getting somebody to make a change, especially when it comes to diet or really anything, right? And I came to the conclusion that for my work, right, what I do on a daily basis, I didn't really have any real structure around what I wanted to ask an investor, right? Besides, kind of the obvious, how much money are you going to provide? When? What do your allocations look like? There is, to say the least, a template, right, of what to ask. But the structure of how to ask that was lacking. And I thought this was a really interesting opportunity to research what I've then learned is a very well empirically based structure for asking questions. And really what it allows the person who's being asked the questions, in my case, it might be an investor, or it could be somebody who's listening onto this podcast. They're trying to recruit a potential platform investment, or for you, it could be a new client for your business, or as you're recruiting a prospective candidate. It's really trying to get self-reflection and clarity and an understanding of what is a goal for that individual, and then how can they act on it. And it's particularly useful when there's hesitation, there's complexity in the decision-making, or there's competing priorities at play, which is to say, it's always useful, right? Particularly in our positions, right, where it's incredibly complicated. So, for me, it could be maybe they're not sure of how a fund strategy fits into their allocation, or they're struggling with internal timing or competing priorities. They're curious, but they're not ready to commit. So, this framework allows you to really understand where they are in a decision-making process. Importantly, allows you to build trust by listening, not just presenting. I think that's a really key component of this.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully you can increase conversions of your conversations by surfacing the reasons to take an action. And that's really important. Actually, really the two last points. I think what's nice about this structure is you're not pitching somebody really hard on your particular strategy or whatever it is. You're trying to figure out if it's a fit for them. And I think what we talked about in the last conversation is, when does it make sense to not pursue a particular investor, or in your case, a particular candidate? You want to figure that out very quickly. And so if they come to the conversation and they're like, what, after we've talked, I don't really feel like it's time for me to make an investment, or I'm not really looking that seriously for a new job. I'm happy where I am. To your, points you've made, I think in some of your, what you've written, maybe is pretty useless, right? You want somebody to say, yes, these are the steps I'm thinking about taking, or no, which can be even more useful. And we can talk about how do you handle objections in motivational interview, because it does actually provide a framework for that. You can then dig into what does that no really mean, and is there a way to even work around it? But sometimes a firm no is just a great way to, move on to another conversation as well.
Perfect. So if we just look at the context of it, so I know motivational interview, and we spoke just before we hit report isn't the best names or best of name for this, but that tends to be the case. Situational leadership's fairly ominous with regards to what it is as well. But you're not using this from a lens. Obviously, I could use it from my work in executive search, but you're not using this in the lens from a assessment of a candidate perspective. You're actually using this in a path of how you're going about capital raising and your assessment of potential prospects. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think the broad framework is applicable to a lot of different situations. So I would use this primarily on an intro call with a new prospective investor. It could be when discussing a new fund or structure. It's particularly helpful when somebody is hesitant or skeptical. And then really trying to then determine how likely is that person to move forward. So it really is helpful for managing the pipeline of the prospective investors you're engaged with. And it's really in the kind of contemplation stage, right? If you're in my world, if you're already in like a legal due diligence, there might be aspects of motivational interviewing that could be helpful from like a negotiation standpoint. I think this is actually a perfect framework. And there's a book, Start With No, by Jim Camp. I think that's the title. That's definitely the author, where a lot of his kind of suggestions on negotiation, while he doesn't outright say it, has a lot of roots in motivational interviewing. He's really trying to get the root cause of someone's goals and really get the negotiator to think in the terms of the other person's goals, to then see if you can get them to act in a certain way. So that's really the framework. And because it sounds so generic, and by design it really is, it can be applied to a lot of different things. I get plenty of practice when I'm talking to my kids or my wife at home, trying to ask them to do something or how school is. I still get the answer good. So I still have some work to do on my own.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a quick mention of our long-standing partnership with Grata. As you will probably know, the private equity scene is constantly evolving, and deal flow is moving now to proprietary and data-driven processes. Grata provides you with the data and information of over 7 million private companies. So if you're looking to improve your proprietary deal flow and improve the data access, then reach out to Grata today. Now back to the podcast. So talk to us there. Give us a bit of an example around you're on a call, a meeting with a prospect LP. What are you, how, talk to us a little bit about the methodology to use there, how you frame questions differently, depending on what answers they give. Just give us a bit more context on that.
Yeah. So what's great is it really is a very structured process. But I think what I have found personally, as I can walk you through the structure, so your listeners can benefit from it, even just taking the basic framework or the template, especially these interrogative questions, these open-ended questions are really helpful, right? And I think we all hear that from time to time, use open-ended questions. It helps get information out. More information is better, right? All those things. But this actually applies a specific framework to it. It will sound very intuitive, but I think what's nice about it is you have now a structure to follow as you're working through these questions. One of the things that's really important, just to kind of harken back before I dive into all this, from our last conversation, is making sure that you have these questions in mind ahead of time. You have agenda you're working with, to have sign off on that agenda. So much of motivational interviewing is making sure that the person you're talking to always has a sense of agency. They're not going to act or answer questions if they don't feel like they're the ones that are coming up with the responses. They don't feel pressured, right? No one really likes to be boxed in, right? So the nice thing about this particular structure is it allows for someone to have the feeling of flexibility and freedom. You still, as the person who's, working through the agenda, the organizer of the meeting, you're still empowered, right? You're still the one in charge of getting through everything, but you're ceding some of that control over the other party. And that's really important because now they feel comfortable talking to you, and that comfort is really important. So I'll walk through these stages if that's okay with you.
Perfect.
So the first stage is called the engagement stage, and I think colloquially we can call it the high stage. And this is the first of 4 stages. So this is really important. We're building trust and rapport. And the goal here is to create a safe space for open dialogue. So for investor relations, it would be very simple. What led you to take this meeting? So why is that question really important? Well, it's open-ended, right? It's allowing them to think through and describe to you why they're there in the first place. And it allows you to start to get those first steps of what could be their goal behind taking this meeting, right? And so you may come in having done all your research, right, on this investor, thinking, oh, they want, new allocation to industrials because they're underweighted or whatever. But they may come in and say, I've heard really good things about you from some other LP. I wanted to take this because of your reputation, right? And they may not even be thinking about allocation, right? That could just be icing on the cake, so to speak. So the second stage is focusing. This is clarifying your goals and your direction. So you're trying to understand, what does the investor care most about? So an example question here would be, what kind of exposure are you looking to add in your portfolio? So here you're listening for signals of appetite for, in my world, risk tolerance, areas of focus. You're trying to zero in on, all right, we have a goal, but what is the context for that goal? Why do they care about it? Is there something important from a diversification perspective? Are they looking for a cash on cash return profile? Figuring out the specific wheres and what fors for your particular product is really important. And these 2 stages also allow you to very quickly verify whether or not this meeting is even appropriate, right? Because if they start talking about things that are totally irrelevant to you, then pretty soon you're going to figure out, okay, this doesn't make sense in a conversation. What I think might be helpful, Alex, is we can go through this and talk about maybe your experience with like candidates, and hearing kind of your perspective on this. The next stage is the evoking stage. So this is the why stage. And we kind of came on this in the focusing stage. This is drawing out internal motivations for action. So allowing the investor to articulate their reasons to explore whatever you might have. So, why would a differentiated industrial approach be compelling for allocations for this year, right? So now you're really kind of digging into what is going to motivate them to act today or in the future, giving them a time frame. And that really allows you to come into the next stage. But here we start to look for what they call in motivational interviewing change talk. So this is desire, their ability to change, their reasons to change, their needs to change. So these are really important contextual clues that you can then dig into to help move and motivate somebody to change. The next stage is very important. And I think there's some irony here because we feel like we have a really successful conversation with an individual, right? We've done such a good job talking to them, listening to them, hearing why they could be really excited, and then the meeting ends, right? And you feel really good about it, but there's no next steps, right? And that's obviously a problem, right? So the last stage, the planning or how stage, is really important. So you're collaborating here on next steps and a commitment to those next steps. And you're co-developing action items. So you could say, it sounds like this could be a potential fit for you this year. What are the next steps for you on your side to investigate this? And would it make sense for us to have a follow-up call with X, Y, and Z and our investment team to talk through our case studies? That could be a way of drawing out specific things. Maybe earlier in the conversation, they said, we're really interested in your value creation. And you say, we could talk about case studies, and you bring that back to the house stage. And it's important to provide reaffirmations, but permissions also for follow-up. Now, throughout this entire process, it hopefully didn't sound like I am trying to box them into an answer, right? Or I'm trying to pitch them really hard on my particular investment strategy or what have you. For me, I am trying to get out information to see whether or not there is an ability, a willingness to act on something. And what's nice again about this framework is it gives you a very specific structure for doing that. So again, you're engaging that person, you're making them feel comfortable. You're then focusing the conversation on goals. You're seeing what are the motivations behind those goals. That's the evoking stage. And then there's the planning stage.
Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, similar to I think is it sales model AIDA, AIDA. If you've ever heard of that before, similar type of framework for it. So you're using this framework. You kind of exploration, kind of initial phase, building rapport, as you mentioned, creating a safe place, and then focusing to kind of understand, qualify, kind of clarify, and then getting into that why stage. What are the internal motivators, which I assume is where motivational interviewing predominantly comes from, and then looking at next steps. Just talk to us about different elements where this has been useful for you in that exploration from a perspective of an LP, where you've used that kind of framework, found different opportunities, found they had different clarificate or different expectations from the conversation than you had, and just how then you've been able to leverage that rather than talking about the wrong thing for the first half an hour and then getting into what you actually want to, what they want to get from the discussion.
Yeah, there was a really interesting one. And no, I'll keep it somewhat high level. This occurred outside of my current job, previous job. I was working to raise capital for a strategy, and it was coming outside of a completely different bucket. So it was a real estate investment strategy, and we were looking to raise infrastructure capital. And no one really, to my knowledge, had raised infrastructure capital for this specific sector focus, right? But you could apply this to private equity, credit, what have you. And so when I called the investor, I had a very kind of, I had a thesis in mind as far as why infrastructure capital actually would be a fit for real estate. But if I just told them right out the gate, this is why I think this is such a great idea, they probably have been like, okay, that's it. That's a really adorable idea you had. And hang up the phone. Instead, I kind of walked through this process. Now, did I follow this template exactly? Maybe, but what I can do is kind of walk through this conversation. And this is obviously years ago, so of course, I'm taking some poetic license here. So of course, the first stage was the engagement stage, right? And the engagement stage here was understanding where they were as far as their allocations. And specifically, I was very interested in their allocations to social infrastructure. And we talked about that and why social infrastructure was important to them. So we kind of skipped it a step and went to the why stage, right? But it was important to get to there. But then I kind of dialed back and I said, well, what are you doing to fulfill your bucket for investing in social infrastructure? And they said, it's very hard to find deals right now. And generally speaking, it was at the time in the market, it was very hard to find infrastructure deals in general. And so I started to understand what are their goals. They needed social infrastructure, right? They were having trouble finding those opportunities. And then I kind of started to talk about, well, have you considered this particular subsector in real estate? And they said, no. And they gave me a litany of reasons. And I kind of walked them through why our subsector actually looked like a very similar one and why it was actually probably better for them as an investment. And they thought that was really interesting. So they began to realize that after I kind of walked them through, oh, these elements that we just talked about during the what stage and the why stage began to overlay on what I was talking about, the particular product that I had and why that could be a fit for them. So then importantly, we went to the how stage, right? And why this was really important for them was really critical. I said, look, if it makes sense for us to pursue this, I'm happy to have a further conversation, but, I want to first understand, what is your thoughts on how this could be interpreted by your investment committee? Because this is new for them. And so they then talked about this, right? And so, up front, we talked about, what are the potential objectives, objections, that, they could have encountered. And we could then dive into those objections. We can talk a little bit about objection handling, Alex, if that's helpful. But then we talked about the how stage. And so I said, if it makes sense, how would you guys typically underwrite a new asset class? We walked through that particular stage. And then I said, okay, we can layer in, going over the market. We can go over our particular differentiated approach, et cetera. And then, I think it was like 9 or 10 months later, we ended up getting an investment from them. It was a pretty significant one. And as far as I knew, it was the first investment from infrastructure for this particular subsector. So it's a really great outcome. But I think, not to pat myself on the back too quickly, I definitely went and tried to have those other similar conversations with other infrastructure groups, and they did not progress in a commitment. Well, why was that? Well, it's because while they saw that another group had done that, they told me, look, like, our investment committee isn't really prepared to make those types of investments. And I said, well, why is that? And they explained that to me. And I kept that in mind for a while. And once those opportunities arose for me to revisit that conversation with them, well, what do you think I did? I went back and I talked to them about it, right? And so then they became more and more interested in that particular potential opportunity. So even though there was a no, I didn't necessarily let that diminish my hope that we could do something in the future. But what's nice about this structure is I knew what the objection was and what would potentially unlock their ability to then make a future investment. So even though with one group I was successful and one group I wasn't successful with as a capital raiser, I'm always looking for, is there another opportunity to work together, right? And I like this structure because it gives me an understanding of what the objectives are of the group and what their objections are to a particular stage in, moving forward, or a particular strategy that I might be talking to them about.
I think what's interesting about this is basically using effective questioning in order to get the agenda, the what's important for the prospect out, really exploring that, and then being able to then link it in. I think a lot of people in any role in a I know investor relations don't like to see themselves as salespeople, but in any role, whether it's selling the firm for capital raising, whether it's selling the firm for deal origination, it's trying to understand what are the intrinsic motivators, those intentional requirements from your prospect, and beginning
Mhm.
to really explore and see where that fits. And you know, a lot of everything we have, nothing fits perfectly every time. Like, nothing works out. If we shot every time we hit, we wouldn't be making enough shots. We want to increase that. So nothing works perfectly, but I think what's interesting here is you have a model that frames around being able to come out of a conversation and probably understand where there's a fit and alignment and where there isn't. And you're able to go in and go, hey, these guys want to do this, this, and this. And you can probably come out of that conversation quite early rather than going down the end of the road and then going, oh no, they've invested in oil and gas. And you're like, well, that seems a bit of a weird one. Like, we're a healthcare impact orientated firm, and these guys are just invested in oil and gas. Well, I clearly haven't done that. And then we go, hey, that's all their fault. They've decided to change their strategy. Whereas literally what you're trying to do is trying to build on that initial foundations of, let's build a bit of rapport, understand things, create an environment. Right, let's focus on what you guys want to get. Where do you want to be? And then going into the why stage, drawing out those motivations and what would create that, and therefore coming out with those objections. Is that a fair understanding of that model?
Yeah, it's a very fair understanding of the model. No, you did a great job of summarizing. It's funny, Alex, because you actually, and I've noticed this through your podcast, so allow me to compliment you for a moment. do a really good job of summarizing this and other content that you're hearing. What's funny is that, to me, is that this actually takes one of the critical skill sets for motivational interviewing. It's called OARS, and that stands for open-ended questions, affirmations, which is what you did, reflective listening, and summarizing. So I'll walk through that. So the open-ended questions, we talked about that, right? What would an ideal partner look like? You started, why or how have you used this particular structure? Then you provided an affirmation. You recognize the strengths. You built my confidence as a speaker, right? It builds your confidence as the people you're interviewing, whether on your podcast or probably for your job, right? And that helps them feel comfortable, talk more. And then you have reflective listening, right? You're rephrasing or restating to ensure mutual understanding. That is incredibly important. We talked about the book Super Communicators, I think in the last one. It's this idea of looping for understanding, where you're trying to rephrase what you've just heard. And one of the things I think people are really afraid of in communications is reflective listening for negative talk as well. Like when I'm talking to a particular investor, I might say, it sounds like the timing is the biggest constraint for this quarter. Is that right? Rather than letting something like that just air out or just not even be addressed, it's important to bring that up, right? And it's important for them to feel like you're actually listening to both the positive things they've been saying, but also the potential negative things that they're holding them back. And then you can dig into those things. And then what you've done is summarized, you're tying together the insights, you're reinforcing, the alignment of understanding. And then in this case, you try to maybe clarify for next steps as well. So in my world, it would be, so you're interested in, particular investment in healthcare private equity. You're looking for this particular type of co-investment, and you're looking to invest over a 12 to 18 month period. Let's explore that further. So that allows us to summarize what they've been able to articulate in a very kind of concise way. But often people just write it down and they just let it go. But it's nice to hear that. I mean, it's going to be like an overly simple example. But when you're at a restaurant, it's nice to hear the server reflect what the conversation was as far as the menu orders, because, God forbid they come back and they give, your date the wrong item on the menu. It's embarrassing for you. You feel terrible. And then, all of a sudden, your date is not going very well, right? So it's important really across all aspects of life. But I think it's one thing that we could always do a better job of.
I agree with that. I think what's interesting about it, and I can think about this when we're using this from an assessment of talent perspective, and
Yeah.
people have, and I don't just mean with the model, but what I mean is with the intentional level. I think what's interesting about the IR role, the deal origination, business development role, and these different positions now starting to appear and become more common in private equity, is that there's a lackingness of their ability to be able to understand what good looks like in those positions. And what I think is really interesting about what I'm going to put down as the kind of intentional nature of what you're trying to do to understand the prospects in its full entirety. And in any role, in any world, in anything, whether it's sales or not sales or whatever you want to put a title on, what tends to be the case is that we tend to blame others for not getting what we want, and whether that's really, really small marginal gains versus, a huge deal closing or whatever else, we tend to go, well, they weren't right, they weren't with us. But I think what's interesting about what you've created there is you're able to be intentional around what the prospect wants, what they need, whether this is the right prospect, that kind of qualification stage, and as you put it, as the kind of focusing, to be able to allow you to come away and go, right, we're reaching out to the wrong people here, or this is just the wrong person at the wrong firm, the wrong person, the wrong firm entirety, the wrong LP, whatever it would be. And then being able to come away and go, right, what can we do differently? How could we be better? Where's our better targeting, rather than complete number arbitrage we need to speak to 100 people and then one of them will buy. Well, that's fine. But if we spoke to 50 people, what would that need to look like? What if we got it down to 25, and how you improve those metrics numbers? I think it's what's really interesting about when we look at talent perspective is just to lead this into the talent side, which appreciate is the premise of this conversation, but that's what, I just want to give everyone listening, that is what you're looking for when you're looking for exceptional people, is they're able to bring models and frameworks and able to articulate what they're doing with regards to the work and how they're, whether it's M&A, talent building, EBITDA increases, organic revenue growth, whatever it is, they're able to go, here's what we do, here's how we play it. So I think that's a really interesting model of being able to then go, well, actually, you can reflect on whether what's going well, what's going poorly. Whereas the people that go, well, I just know how to do it because I've done it for 20
Right.
years. Well, you can't replicate that. It doesn't work all the time. Well, nothing works all the time, but it doesn't work on a replication. You can't train that into other people, other bits and pieces. So I think that's a really interesting way of um, of looking at IR type work, but anything within a private equity firm and simplicity of how that runs. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, no, I think that the one thing you really nailed is the ability to replicate the model, right? It's not just some unstructured, hopefully we get the answers we're looking for approach to figuring out what our investors' needs are or what the client's needs are that you might be trying to work with to help them with recruiting.
Mhm.
I wonder, for you and your business, what do you see as far as how do people apply or not apply frameworks when they're interviewing candidates? What happens when they don't? Or actually, probably more relevant, maybe they're really good at interviewing candidates. They're very good at applying a structured interview methodology. But when it comes to trying to recruit clients, they just, wing it. And, they don't have a concise pitch about who they are as an organization. And there's this big dissonance, right, between the two. How do you see that kind of in your industry?
I think there's a lot of not. I think it's just generally in any space of people trying to tell people what they should be doing before they're doing it. If we look at people within our industry of trying to, basically go, hey, we'll do X, Y, and Z for you. If we look at it from a perspective of a chief exec at a portfolio company, a CFO at a portfolio company, what whether it's this framework or another framework or AIDA model, whatever it is, AIDA is more of a selling model than an exploration model, but the main frame here is there's a lot of people who are trying to tell you what to do before they know what you want, before they you need, and before they know what needs to happen. And I think what's interesting within our world is, in executive search, there's a lot of people that just go, hey, what you need is a chief exec that's worked in the space, that's done X, Y, and Z. And sometimes they're right, and you hit. But what it's got to be understood is not always this part of what read in my book, but sometimes the role that you think you require that you need to hire for is not the role you actually need. There's a different role that fits a different constraint in the business, that's more important. It just looks like X, Y, and Z. Now, I appreciate if you're missing a CEO, that's probably likely something you want to get sorted out as quickly as possible. But it might be actually that you don't need the CFO as the second hire, it's COO. You don't need X, you don't need Y. But I think what can be taken from any of this is that understanding piece, and that can be reflective both in when you're being sold to or selling to someone else, or trying to explore something to somebody else, or interviewing somebody else, all these different models, but also when you're thinking about what you're looking to do. Uh, what do we want to achieve here? Why are we making these decisions? What are we actually looking to accomplish? We want to grow X EBITDA. We want to grow X revenue. Okay, why are we doing this? What's the kind of premise around it? And I think just a little bit of that reflection, I think even using that model in that frame. But there's far too many people that just go in with the resulting element. Like the amount of phone calls I get about our phone systems. And I had one yesterday and it was, hey Alex, we've spoken before. We wasn't the right time for you to swap phone systems. Previously, you mentioned to me you've got some handsets in the business. So it was either spent literally 30 seconds, a minute, half an hour, felt like trying to sell to me, and then eventually came out of the phone. And I'd never spoken to them because we don't have handsets and everything for a VoIP system. And immediately then hung up on me. And then his colleague rang me back the following day,
Oh my
or whatever it was, or today or whatever, and tried to sell me the same thing. And I was like, "Hey, you were the guys that hung up on me, etc." But I think it's just that exploration side that gives that
God.
both gives us the indication we have somebody really looking to understand and can then go, here's where I've done this before, and here's the playbook for it. If it's in a portfolio lens or if it's in a private equity lens, we've seen that type of deal before. This is what we did about it, and this is how we helped you as your firm, as when we acquired them, to scale and grow without having to strip out all the people, etc. from there. But I think we just go into immediate, oh yeah, I understand what you're trying to do. You want to scale the business, you want to exit, you
Right.
want those money. Well, some actually might not be the biggest requirements for that owner of that business or LP or whatever else with who you're speaking to.
So it sounds to me like when you're talking to a client about their hiring needs, you're really trying to say, or maybe I'm trying to glean this from what you were mentioning. They may say, "Hey, we're looking to grow, EBITDA by X, Y, and Z, and I think that these are the right people to help us do that." You are beginning to understand, all right, this is the type of candidate that you should be looking for, but then digging further into that, well, why is that important to you? Are you planning on selling, or are you planning on entering a new market? If it's a new market, maybe I can zero in on the type of candidates that I should be looking for because they need to have this type of experience in this subsector of this new market. If you can figure out what the motivation is, do you find that data point to be helpful, or is there kind of a discovery process where you think a framework like this could be useful to you? It sounds like it might be kind of what you're doing or trying to ascertain to really find that right candidate that helps the business out.
95% of all business problems are people problems in disguise. Over the last 6 months, I've been intently writing a brand new book, all focused on the experiences that I've collated from some of the top private equity firms and investors on how they interview and select top executive talent for their portfolio companies. To go on the waiting list for this book and receive a free copy for the first 100 added, please check out the show notes and get your name on the waiting list today. If you look at it in the discovery call nature, the answer is yes. But if you look at it from the discovery call nature, a lot of the problems with private equity is when private equity sees their problem, they see the problem they have at the moment, which no executive in the portfolio companies,
Mhm.
nobody doing IR for them currently, nobody doing X. And if we just look at it from a portfolio lens, when they see the problem that sits right here now in front of their face, and then they see the problem at exit, they miss that huge part in between, which is that whole period, which is advertised at 3 to 5 years and usually 5 to 7, is what happens in between that journey. And that's where I see a lot of firms get their hires wrong, is because they hire for the ERP implementation, they hire for the M&A type work, and that's the things that face right now. They hire for the fact they haven't got the right people, they need professionalization. And whereas, and then they go, well, have you done an exit? The answer being question, hopefully being yes. Right. Well, you've done the first bit we need and the last bit, that chunk in the middle. So it's unearthing what the journey of the business needs to go on. And a lot of that is kind of pulling out the actual unknown.
Mm.
That is industry particular understanding of what evolution a business would need to go through at the scale levels that it's going through, what industry it's in, and how that portrays with regards to size of client, size of prospect, and all those elements that come and sit into that kind of middle scaling period. And trying to understand that. And as we go through that kind of focus on why states, that's where we spend a lot of time at, because you can hire somebody with industry experience who's taken a business to an exit that's also done an M&A roll up, but whether or not they can withhold the middle period. Now, the
Mhm.
ideal scenario from a private equity portfolio perspective is that they would hire 3 people, They would hire a person to come in and do immediate change as an exec. They would then hire the person to come in and go through the growth phase, and they would hire the last person to come in and do an exit. Now, they're not going to do that, and I'm not, oh God, an executive search firm say we need 3 CEOs in 5 years rather than one. I mean, on average, you're hiring two anyway, so you might as well do it, actually, to be fair. But you need to find the person that can take you through that whole journey. And yeah, I agree. Using that model would be incredibly useful to try and draw out some of that information rather than we healthcare services,
Right.
um, yeah, pediatrics, whatever it would be. Business, we want to scale GP business. We want to scale from 10 locations to 100 locations and revenue from X to Y. Just find there's a person that's done a little bit of that. And sometimes it is as simple as that. And then we can see it and we can do it and hit right. But if people want to bring their percentages from below 30 success rate on C-suite hires to above 80, 90, they're going to have to change something.
I think what I like about your approach on this and the way you kind of walk through is that it sounds to me like you're a business consultant more than even a recruiter, right? Like I am in service of this business to help them achieve their goals. I'm trying to find the right person for the right time frame or life cycle of this business. And if I'm successful, this person's going to be able to allow you to achieve whatever you're trying to, go for in the future. And if I'm not successful, it's going to be harder to do that, right? And I think that one of the things and I can't remember where I heard this, is that in today's world, we went from offering solutions, and that was useful to do, right, in the world, right? We have the best widget, we have the best service. Now we actually have to be problem finders. And if we're problem finders, we know that somebody has a goal, but they have a gap to get there, right? And that's kind of what you're describing here, is that there is a gap, right? And we can fill it with a person. And, allowing us to do that through our network to find the very best individual to suit this need allows us to then kind of be able to solve the problem that you're looking to solve, right? And even though we may not frame it that way, we're looking for a goal, it's still a problem, right? Because it's an unmet goal. And I think that if you don't have a way of asking questions to kind of go back to this larger framework to figure out what those goals are and what are the problems preventing them from getting those goals, and then hearing, well, what are the steps that they could take and how can you assist them in those steps, then that allows you to get on board, right? And hopefully gets your client on board for having them have commitment to a process that you're going to be going through. Because, God forbid you get a bunch of great candidates and they're like, yeah, I don't have time to talk to them, right? Now they're on the same page as you as far as like, okay, I really do feel like I'm committed to this process. I'm going to allow Alex and his team to help me with my business. They understand what the needs are, and now we can work together on solving those. And we're going to do it through finding those best candidates. And now Alex has a great idea of where I'm at and what I need, and we can find those people that can fill that particular position.
Yeah, you can come and join the team and sell it like that to each prospect that we work with. Absolutely. You'd referenced the negotiation side, so I'm keen to dive into that and see how you're handling that. What typical negotiations you come into play with regards to LPs? Not something I've ever spoken about on the podcast previously. And then, kind of, if you have another kind of model of how you handle this.
Yeah, I'd say really briefly, for negotiations, say around fees or allocations, it comes to figuring out what the goals are for the client, right? And then framing your objections or objectives in those particular frames, right? And so if they're sensitive to fees, there's probably a way that you can figure out a structure that accommodates that sensitivity, but still allows you to achieve, your kind of desired profitability from the capital that particular client is committing. And what's useful to do ahead of that particular meeting is to really figure out what the goals are for you as an organization, but frame them in the context of the client, right? So in other words, the client or prospective investor, your goal is to provide an investor the opportunity to invest in, the best, most, diversified bulge bracket private equity firm to give them broad exposure to these, three sectors. And providing that framework then allows you to go into the negotiation with a goal-oriented attitude that reflects hopefully what your client is. And you can use this motivational interviewing structure to clarify that goal or to change it completely. But at least you're working towards a mutual understanding of what they want to get out of their commitment. That allows you to then get into the minutia of, I'm going to negotiate with you on fees, and we're working towards your goal rather than my goal. And that can be a really helpful way of reframing things. When it gets into objections that somebody has about, a particular investment or a way that you're kind of walking them through the process or a fee structure, there's really 3 steps that motivational interviewing offers that can be very helpful in a negotiation. So the first step is embracing and listening. So very much like what Alex, you and I were talking about, it's that reflective listening. It sounds like you're concerned about, concentration risk within a sector specific fund. This may be in regards to, the size of their allocation. So then the really important step is reframing this as a shared objective. So you could say, so for this to make sense for both of us, we would need to show how diversification is built into our platform, right? So then again, you're getting into, hey, I've recognized you have an objection. Let's reframe that to allow you to help achieve your goals. And then the third is confirm and gain buy-in. If we can address this, would you be open to, the target allocation that we've discussed before that you're typically looking at, 30 to 50 million as part of reviewing this deal. So you're making sure that if they feel comfortable with what you've provided as far as a framework, that you have buy-in, and they can always, of course, change their mind. And you want to say that if that makes sense to you, or if you think that's a reasonable step, those are important things to add in there. Then they feel like they have buy-in as far as, well, is the process for me to get comfortable about this particular position? And then you can kind of go from there. So I think that's a really helpful, smaller framework as far as being able to dive into that particular component of a negotiation. But that comes up all the time, right? And these negotiations really are conversations around hopefully shared goals.
Mm-hmm.
But now you're taking the approach of, I'm understanding your goal, we're working towards it. And it makes the person feel much more comfortable. And that's such an important part about this whole negotiation framework. And to get about, we talked about making that person feel comfortable ahead of the conversation, is reinforcing that comfort, reinforcing that autonomy so they feel comfortable going into that conversation. And again, you're not forcing them to do anything. You're giving them plenty of opportunities to say no about something. And that's really important too, because again, you're giving them a sense of control over the process, but you're still in control of the process itself.
Excellent. Excellent. No, I appreciate that. And thanks for the insight on the negotiation side of the IR work. So since I don't remember last time our podcast aired, Sam, but from our past podcast, is there any materials that you've read, books, etc., or any podcasts, anything you've listened to that you think, I'd like to shoot them out? I know you shared some with us last time.
Yeah, I would say Negotiation Genius. It's written by 2, I think, Harvard Business School professors. It's a name that I feel like is a little over the top, but it's a really great book. The first part of the book goes into kind of, I think, what you learn in business school as far as like BATNA and all these other kind of terms that they throw around. But then the last 3/4 of the book is much more technical as far as like, here's the specific instances you're working in as far as negotiations,
Yeah.
how to apply it if there's imbalance as far as power. Here's how you could potentially approach that particular situation. I thought it was a phenomenal book. And I think what's important about that book is it's about really making a bigger pie and making sure that you can figure out a solution that works for all parties. It doesn't necessarily mean win-win. What it means is, can we find an optimal solution for everybody? So I think that that's important as well, because one of the books that I would recommend, Getting to Know, or Start with Know, by Jim Camp. He's very adamant about not having win-win situations. I'm not really sure if I buy into that. But when you start reading his book and and he kind of goes into this idea of being goal-orientated for the other person on the side of the negotiation table, like we just talked about, the person you're speaking with, all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense to try to figure out a structure that they feel works for that. Whether you call that win-win or not, I feel like is irrelevant. You're trying to make a deal that actually works for all parties. Otherwise, no one's going to agree to it. The other book I would recommend, again, that I mentioned on the last podcast, was Quit by AIDA. This is a book that I think is very important for anybody in business. It's extremely important. He goes through, why are we, not good at quitting? What are the decisions that hold us back from quitting, and how to be more thoughtful about how and when to quit? I think is very important. We get so invested in these processes, whether it's negotiations or sales, we don't know when it's time to stop. And I think that that's a really good book to put some governors around your life and the way that you handle business. So it's a fantastic book, and I'd highly recommend it again. So yeah, that's kind of it for me, Alex.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Sam, if anybody wishes to reach out to you post this podcast, how best to get in touch with you, please?
Yeah, feel free to reach out through LinkedIn. After the last podcast, there's a lot of great people that I connected with. Really appreciated that, and love to connect with more of your listeners in the future.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us for round two, Sam. Appreciate you investing your time again, sharing us all around your framework, and going through those 4 stages, how we can apply that to various different things. Obviously, capital raising from your perspective, did origination, my perspective of interviewing, but I think just general conversations that we're having with people to explore their landscape. So pretty appreciate your time coming on for round 2.
Thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great being back.
And thank you very much for all our listeners for yet again tuning in to the Private Equity Podcast. Till the next time, keep smashing it, and thank you very much for listening.